welcome to the Nouveau podcast, the podcast that models healthy communication for men, empowering them to start the journey of self-work. Now here's your host, Thomas Pierce.
All right, everybody, welcome along. It's another Thursday, another episode of the Nouveau podcast. It's your host, Thomas Pierce. This week, my guest is Brent Giannotta. He's a Los Angeles native who, inspired by 9/11, became fluent and studied Arabic, earned a grad degree in Egypt, and then worked as a CIA counterterrorism analyst for 5 years. He tracked ISIS external operators and extremist psychology. And last year, in 2021, he published an LA Times op-ed comparing radicalization trends between ISIS foreign fighters and U.S. political conspiracy theorists. So he's now, you could say, in a budding career as a commentator. Maybe that's the way to put it. And I wanted to get Brent on to talk about political polarization and also the profile of these mass shooters that we've seen recently, because they tend to be white and male, and at least the one in Buffalo, there have been numerous other examples, are motivated by white supremacist and racist extremist ideology. So I think it's a timely conversation, and welcome to the pod, Brent.
Hey, thanks, Thomas. Thanks for having me. This is great.
Yeah, for sure. So you're a SoCal guy. How would you say you ended up in Egypt, and how was that experience actually going over there and being a student?
Yeah, well, 9/11 happened my junior year of college at USC in LA. So we were physically separated from all the destruction, but obviously glued to the TV and just trying to figure out what the hell just happened, just like everybody else was. This is 2 days before my 21st birthday. And so I am in the part of college where I've chosen a major already, but I'm still a free agent. I can switch. So I happen to have chosen international relations, which is exactly where I needed and after that really wanted to be. And so I know something clicked in my head that day where, like, what I just saw, these planes hitting the towers and this like totally bizarre, almost out of a movie attack on our country, whatever caused it and its ramifications seem to be like the most important thing in all of humanity and would probably stay that way for a long time. And I don't know what it is about me. I just need to be doing the most important thing. Like everything else kind of seems frivolous in comparison. So my kind of like intellectual adult brain got focused in a way that it really never had before. I mean, I was in a fraternity, I was playing on my school's hockey team, traveling a bunch, kind of like being a very normal college student, just making all the mistakes and, just like doing whatever with friends. But in a way, I guess I like to think I turned into a little more of an adult that day. And I later found I wasn't the only one.
Yeah.
So now I'm like, every morning I'm reading the newspaper, which had been delivered to my fraternity house every morning. I just never really noticed it because it's like wasn't part of my morning routine. But now I'm like, my face is on the front page. It's like reading everything. I signed up for Arabic class. I started taking that. And then I graduate. And I took an internship in DC for a member of Congress. And if you've ever interned in Congress, like the work you're doing is not so interesting. The interesting part is like being where you are. So you're seeing the congressperson go in and out. You're going to hearings. Like the press sometimes comes in. Sometimes ambassadors come in. Like that stuff is cool. All like the milieu around you. But what you're doing every day is like you're clearing out databases and you're shredding mail and you're answering the phone and like trying not to get yelled at. So a part of it is very exciting, but it kind of gets old after a few weeks. And so the only place that my mind went was to the Middle East, where that's where that excitement is. That's where like the really contentious and important issues concerning humanity are. And so I went online in my free hours at this job and I found a scholarship. I applied, I wrote some essays. I flew back to LA to do some interviews and I got this thing and they paid for my grad school in Egypt. So
Sick.
Now we're talking August of 2006, like a lifetime ago. And I get to Cairo and it's August. So it is like beyond hot. And the first thing I notice is that no one's wearing shorts. Like they just don't wear shorts in Egypt. It's like not part of the culture. they're an Islamic culture in their own style, which the styles of Islam, they really vary from country to country and from town to town. And so now I got to wear jeans, and it's like a million degrees, and it's dusty. And so Cairo is, I learned a lot of stuff about the city I didn't know before. Cairo is probably built for like maybe like 6 million people, but during the day it swells to like 20 million people. So when a bus goes by, like people are hanging out and like off of the windows, off of the back, they're on top. It's like stuff that you would see in like National Geographic or something from India. You know what I mean? The air
Hmm.
pollution is like next level. Like if you've been in LA smog, it's like it's nothing compared to Cairo, because Cairo is, it's on the Nile River, so it's in sort of like a river bed, but then you go a couple miles and then you sort of ascend up in altitude to hit the rest of the desert. So it's in this kind of bowl. So whenever there's any kind of
So it
wind,
just sinks.
yeah, it just like blows all this dust. It accumulates above the city and then just falls on it. So the city is completely covered in dust like all the time. The noise pollution in the middle of Cairo is crazy. I mean, just honking just everywhere. I mean, so we don't really honk in LA anymore because no one wants to get a bullet coming at them from someone who has lost their mind. But honking is just like, that's just 24/7 in Cairo. So you've got all this stuff, all this like very like weird. Oh, the other thing is everything's broken. The infrastructure is terrible. So if something breaks in your apartment, someone comes, you pay them, and instead of like reinstalling or retrofitting, they sort of like tie a wire around it and just hope it stays that way. But it doesn't stay that way. You call them back again and you hand them more money 2 weeks later. So this is kind of how this society works. And for someone like me, a privileged, overeducated, just white kid, and there were, hundreds of me there too. This is a culture shock, like of the first degree. And so your brain has to do something to get through this. You have to somehow convince yourself that all these annoyances and these differences, and just like I can't sleep and it's too hot and I'm uncomfortable pretty much all the time, that this is a good thing for me. And I'm going to embrace this whole experience. And not all of us could do it. A lot of people went home after the first semester and said, I'm done. And so that was like, it's different than studying abroad in like London or Paris. It's being uncomfortable and out of your element all the time and always standing out and having people harass you for whatever reason. It was such an experience that I still see my life as like before Egypt and after Egypt. So that's what that was all about.
Amazing. Amazing, dude.
Oh, thanks.
That's cool. You stuck it out. Yeah, that neuroplasticity, right?
Yeah.
And just changing and rewiring, especially that age.
Mhm.
Yeah, and also it's a big difference from the traditional study abroad and that you're doing grad school. So it wasn't like, oh, I have a 4 months where I can go fuck off. It's like it's like you're
Oh,
on a
there was a lot of
scholarship.
fucking off.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's not get that twisted. But
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
you're right. I had a lot of homework. Like I was reading constantly. I'm not a particularly fast reader. So they were assigning me like a whole lot of reading. I had to get this stuff done. On top of that, I roommate I roomed with two undergrads. They were study abroad kids from Georgetown, like very dear friends of mine. But they had their friends and I met them. And then I met a girl. I started dating her. And like everybody's a couple years younger than me and having a very different experience. Not very different, just a much more lively and exploratory experience than I am. I'm like really trying to get through this work and understand this culture from like the ground up. So yeah, in that sense, it was a bit different.
And how was the progress with your Arabic? Because I did undergrad in DC and I had a lot of friends actually study Arabic. And I would say the only one who became fluent or close to fluent was my buddy Francisco, who has actually been on the podcast, and he grew up bilingually and is just a polyglot. He's just an amazing
Hmm.
linguist.
Hmm.
But it just seemed like everyone else, some of the smartest people I knew, really struggled with it. And then it wasn't until they went there. So like Francisco went to Jordan, I
Hmm.
believe, and
Yeah.
that's when he kind of leveled up. But how was that process? And was it a steep learning curve when you got there? And when did you say you kind of hit that crest, the hill of
The
being
wave, yeah.
comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, good question. So, like, 3 really important points on language learning in Arabic. Arabic is absolutely wild. If you're coming from English, it's just like it's impossible. Number 2 is some people's brains are just wired for this. And, like, if you look at the smartest people you know, like the straight A's, it's not necessarily them. This is a totally different capability in the human brain. And number 3 is that immersion is the only way to get any good at this. So my brain, I don't think I'm good at language learning. I don't think I'm particularly good at it. And I know this because I lost track of how many classes. I probably took like 15 all in all Arabic classes. And more than halfway through, so I've been studying like 8, 9 years. I meet some kid who just starts picking it up really, really fast. So he or she is learning the basics in like a quarter of the time that it took me to learn the basics. And then suddenly by the final
Right.
exam, like they sound better than I do. I'm like, this is bullshit. It's like really frustrating. But but I stuck. I mean, and so we're all humans. Like humans are attracted to things and activities that we're kind of naturally good at, whether it be basketball or
Mhm.
art or drawing or whatever. If you can feel gratification from other people thinking that what you just produce is really awesome, you're going to like that activity. It's like human nature. For some reason, I was the opposite in Arabic. I was terrible. Like I did this intensive summer at UCLA in the summer of 2004, and at the end of it, like there were a couple of kids that just totally blew everybody else away, and I was not one of those people. I was demoralized. But again, going back to the 9/11 experience, this region of the world is really important and in a million ways that I don't understand yet. And so I was just kind of like looking over the horizon. Like I'm about to graduate college. Like I need to start figuring out what the hell I'm doing with myself, with my adult life. And this is the only thing that really gets me going.
Mhm.
And so I can't just drop out because, oh, I like didn't get it on the first try. And like I got a B instead of an A, or I got a C, or, like no one really thinks that I'm going to be any good at this. I got to keep going. And that's what I did. I did 3 more intensive summer programs after UCLA. One of them's at Middlebury in Vermont, which is one of the
Wow.
kind of premier language learning spots in the
3.
country.
Yeah.
And then I went to Beirut. I'm like, I got to get there. And in Beirut, you sign a contract saying you're not going to speak English the whole summer. Of course, you don't fully grab onto that, but as far as like being in the classroom for 5 hours a day, not a word of English. It is all Arabic. So like you can't ask for clarification. You gotta just figure it out. So it is like it's being thrown to the deep end in every sense. And that's the only way to get good at this. And so to answer your question of when it started to click, I mean, after a year in Egypt, yeah. After like every 5 minutes I'm saying, hi, how are you? Oh, I'm good. Oh, this is my name. What are you doing? Like all those like very common words and phrases, those come out without me having to think about them. Suddenly that sort of burrows out some mental bandwidth to focus on the more complicated stuff. And now I can do the complicated stuff. And that's, I think, what fluency is all about, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting because the intro stuff is simple, but it's also really important socially.
Hmm.
So there's the other side of our brain that we need social connection, we need acceptance, we need friends, we need to do business, we need to study, and we can't piss these people off.
Hmm.
So I think for me, it'd be getting tripped up and wanting to make sure I presented myself well. And I had a similar. You talking about that is getting me really stoked because I'm about to move to the Philippines,
Hmm.
and I did do a semester in Germany undergrad, and I only spoke German. I didn't hang out with the Americans. I like
Nice.
went for it, and it was really rewarding,
Hmm.
and I got a lot better, obviously. Um, but yeah, I'm all stoked to go to the Philippines. And actually, I think because I'm going to be working nights, kind of more U.S. style hours, I'll have time I can do classes during the day for
Nice.
Tagalog.
Are you going to be in
Um,
Manila, in the capital
yeah.
there?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So there'll be a lot of English speakers there. If you ever
But that's not the
feel
goal.
right, that's not the goal. Yeah. Just if you ever get
Yeah.
tripped
Yeah.
up and feel
Yeah.
lonely. Yeah. All right, good. It's nice to have a safety net while
Totally.
you're out there.
Totally.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, man. Okay. So then how did you end up getting recruited by the CIA? Did they come for you, or did you go to them? You were probably on the radar, I guess, through that grad program.
I would like to think so, but I didn't feel it. It didn't feel like I was on their radar at all. So maybe I was, and maybe
You
that's
weren't
a
a
testament
five-star
to
recruit.
their ability to maintain
Yeah.
their secrecy. But okay, so I pop out of grad school. Now we're talking summer 2007, and I moved back to LA, where I am now with my family. And you know, now have a graduate degree in Middle East studies. So like I know about the Ottoman Empire, and I know about Middle East politics, also African politics, and I can find most Middle Eastern countries on a map if you give me like 10 seconds. Those skills don't typically translate into lucrative jobs and careers in the United States. So I applied to everywhere you would assume I applied to: the FBI, State Department, DOD, and then the CIA. And the CIA was not my first choice because during my education in the Middle East, I learned that the CIA has a very bad reputation in the Middle East, not only in the Middle East, but in much of the developing world. Back in the 50s, the CIA famously unseated Mossadegh from power in Iran. And Iran was very angry about that, understandably so. And many researchers believe that that was the long-term impetus to the fury and fire that ushered in the Islamic Revolution in 1979, which then ushered in decades of hostility between the Iran and the US. And famously, they say that the average American would feel much more comfortable on the streets of Tehran, Iran, than in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia being a US ally and Iran being a US enemy, which is just like a supreme irony that one could trace all the way back to something that the CIA did in the 50s and probably shouldn't have done. And that's on top of, stuff the CIA did in Central America in the 80s and around the Caribbean, things like that. So I didn't want to be the enemy. I didn't want to be someone who was seen as potentially underhanded or secretly hated this, Islamic or Arab culture. I wanted to be the opposite. I wanted to be welcome, and I wanted to connect and sort of expand my own horizons by knowing these people and allowing them the space to welcome me in. But as I moved to DC, and I did get a job at a human rights organization, again in their Middle East department. So I had a huge education there too. I kept meeting people who were sort of in the orbit of the intelligence industry, and they said, "Man, if you get a job in the CIA, that is just the best because of your opportunities for travel, for the things you will learn, the access to information that you'll have, um, the people you'll meet, like the higher ups you'll be able to brief and travel with, and the embassies you'll visit, and the briefings you'll be able to do, and the trainings." That all sounded like the kind of personal development that I really wanted. And sort of suddenly, like, the bad things and the negatives started to fade into the background. All the positives were sort of piling up on themselves. Then I got rejected. I got a no thank you thing in the mail from the CIA, and I was, pretty disappointed. But that didn't work out. So clearly my path is somewhere else. Meanwhile, my parents are both from Detroit, Michigan. And so I kind of grew up with like a love of ice hockey in my household. So I played from a very young age. So that means that when I moved to DC, I joined a team there. And one guy on one of my teams, he told me that he worked at the CIA. And I told him, like, "Hey, you guys just rejected me." And he asked, "Oh, you said you speak Arabic. Like, is it pretty good?" I'm like, "Yeah, I can convince you that I'm fluent." And he said, "Well, send me your resume." And it turns out that guy was a very senior analyst and had a friend working in human resources for that 1 year. And so one thing led to another, and suddenly it was back on. And then I had a 9-month security background check. And then I started, my first day of CIA was June 2010. And I entered into the Iraq department of the Counterterrorism Center, where everybody was kind of winding down this surge operation by coalition forces to kind of beat Al Qaeda in Iraq into the ground, which had pretty much happened. and sort of mollified the Sunni tribes out in Anbar province, and just all sorts of horrific violence. Things were sort of like calming down, but there were a lot of people still in this department, and it seemed like they didn't all need to be there. But then, not even a year later, the Arab Spring started, and the 500 or so Al Qaeda in Iraq members who were hiding out underground in northern Iraq surged across the border into Syria and they sort of like co opted the fight against the Bashar al Assad regime in Syria. And so, what the CIA did was, this isn't the Iraq department anymore, it's the Syria Iraq department. And so now we've got the two most important, most dynamic countries in the entire Arab world are now under our, not jurisdiction, but sort of like are our problem. And so when I got there, there was a bit of a lull, but man, it just ramped up right after that. And all of our careers got really wild after that.
Incredible. So what do you mean by our problem? You know, and some would say, who is the U.S. to self-appoint as the police officer in the region? You know, like what's the implication of that kind of positioning?
Yeah, great question. So I remember when I was an undergrad taking these international relations classes, and we're talking like 2000, 2001, 2002. And the question that always came up was like, should the United States be the global watchdog? There's always a binary choice. It's like, do we insert ourselves or do we not? And I've come to believe that's a bit of a false choice. And that if we don't insert ourselves, things can spin out of control to a way that will negatively affect us down the road. But when we do insert ourselves, shit gets real messy and real bad, like real quick. Okay, so there's got to be some middle of the road, right? There's got to be something that we can do where we're not ignoring our problems, but we're also, not ruining lives to achieve like basically nothing in a society that we barely understand. So the conflict in Syria was just another chapter in this very sad chapter of American foreign policy where we are flailing. Like we don't know where on that spectrum we should be. And so we overplayed our hand in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we already knew that by 2010 when I started. In 2011 when the Arab Spring really was like popping off. And so, we've got a new president, Barack Obama, and he knows that the American public is just so sick of boots on the ground type of operations in the Middle East, and like rightfully so. It like hasn't gone well. But he also realized he can't do zero. And so there really wasn't much of a strategy from the White House, which is kind of fine. We can still work. We can still do a whole lot without there being a codified strategy from above, because the CIA, just like any other intelligence agency, we have a mandate, we've got a mission, we've got like plaques and stuff that announce our values. And like I put my right hand up and I took, an oath to serve the Constitution, and that I serve the American people, and at the not the mercy, but there's that phrase where I serve the President of the United States as our number one customer and client. And so as an analyst, we had to help the case officers and spies like get as much information as possible. When they bring it back to us, we figure out like what is important. And then once we find something that's important or threatening, we write it like a journalist into a narrative that we then publish and give to policymakers and decision makers so that they can make better, more informed decisions. And so we did not put boots on the ground, which is probably a very good decision. But we tried to arm the sort of pro-democracy rebels fighting against the Assad regime. And it ended up not really going super well, because one by one, they were kind of selling the arms that we would give them to the jihadists, to the members of Al Qaeda and ISIS and whatnot. And so this whole thing just kind of fizzled out, and we didn't achieve our immediate goals until about 2000, 16 and 17 when we started arming the Kurdish rebels in northeast Syria. And then they eventually rooted ISIS out of Raqqa, which is the city that they call their headquarters. So, I mean, a whole lot of people died. A lot of people died in a really bad way by getting their heads sawed off or being tortured to death or executed. And as CIA analysts, we have to watch those videos um, to sort of understand what these groups are trying to convey, not only to their enemies but to their recruits. And so, I was like up to my eyes in that kind of stuff, and it gives you just a really bizarre and pretty fucked up perspective to parts of the human experience that you and I sitting in the United States like never have to contend with. But this just like horrific turn of events can be the reality for so many billions of people that are in our human family, and you can avoid that reality for your entire life. But for 5 years, my teammates and we had to have this push in our face, and not only that, but try to like do something to help. And I love being able to say that we did do a lot to help. That when we came in on stayed nights and came in on weekends for no extra pay, because we knew that if we did our job really, really well, that like some innocent people would not die before their time. We were able to make that happen for, handfuls of people, but it takes a whole of government approach to do this thing right. And although the Obama administration definitely tried, I don't think we hit the mark on this one. And so that's why I like coming on a podcast like yours. I think that there's an even better way to do this going forward. Unfortunately, our foray into Syria was not something we should look to as an exemplar of how to deal with international conflicts going forward.
Yeah, man, it's such a web of like historical context and also competing interests within the various departments. But that's interesting. It almost sounds like the CIA, your role at least, was kind of the intelligence side, to where the Green Berets would be doing the actual training and the kind of upskilling. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's such a my biggest perception, I think, of these forays is really it's like either, and this maybe is my jadedness, but it's like there's some natural resources or political resources up for grab, or it's a kind of counter push or rebalance the power front of the three world powers. It's like, okay, well, if we don't get in here and exert some influence, then Russia or China will.
Mhm.
And I think that's the thing that, yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting world, and I don't have a great wealth of knowledge, but yeah, it's kind of this side of what we do as a country where there's so much fighting and rightfully so concern about things happening domestically, but there's also these branches of our government that represent us overseas that are not elected. Often they're appointed by a president, and they're
Mhm.
out setting policy and making decisions using a lot of money
Yep.
and making decisions that impact people's lives, and people in the states don't know that that's even happening.
Mhm. Yeah.
So it's like a good thing to read up on. Where would, for someone who wants to learn more about foreign affairs, where would you direct them just to kind of like start to get a picture of what's going on outside of the US?
hmm as a starter, I mean, you could read the international pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. That's a great place to start. Further afield than that, Foreign Policy magazine is pretty excellent. Their articles are short enough and consumable enough. The Economist is pretty good too. If you want more of like a graduate level education in like strategy and sort of like the new thoughts of like where our global security is going and where sort of the positions of Russia, China, and the US are sort of looking to go, you should subscribe to Foreign Affairs magazine. It's put out by the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And I mean, Henry Kissinger and Jake Sullivan and even Stacey Abrams, Joe Biden, they're all published in there. And just a ton of academics who do this stuff for a living. Either they're at Harvard or Yale or Johns Hopkins, or they're at Brookings Institution, again, the Council, and all sorts of other international relations and political science academic research organizations all over the country. So that's a good place to start. Yeah, foreign affairs is really tough because, in contrast to domestic politics, we have so many organizations in our country that are doing studies and polls and researches constantly. We've got all these numbers from government programs from the 40s and 50s. Like, we know how the 29 stock market crash went down and like what happened before that, what happened after that. So we can run these numbers and regression models over and over and over again. But in foreign affairs, we don't have that wealth of data. We don't have, how many world wars do we have? We have two. How many how many invasions of the Arab world do we have? We have like two. It's not enough information to really get a good sense statistically and responsibly about what the fuck are we supposed to be doing? Like, how should we be running this stuff? So that makes me on some level sympathetic that our decision makers are not getting it right. And it's exactly what you said, that in the domestic realm, so many of our laws and bills and sort of things that we want to help improve our society are at the mercy of our legislature. And we are nominally represented, you and me, as like citizen voters, but we're almost overrepresented in that so much like of this digital media hostility is, and wealth inequality, and these companies who flood the hill with their lobbyists. It feels like these representatives in Congress are more beholden to them than to you and me as citizen voters. But in the foreign affairs realm, it's totally different. Like, we don't vote on whether we should invade Iraq or not. Like, no one asked me. I don't know if you voted on that, but I definitely didn't. And covert operations, like, we don't know about covert operations until months or even years after they happen. And not only are these things affecting like the world, a very globalized world where like it affects our economics, but it also affects how you and I see ourselves as Americans. Like, is that a benevolent thing or is that an evil thing? There's a host of great arguments on both sides of those things, because the US has done like horrific shit all over the world, but it's also very literally a beacon of like human liberty to an extent that no other nation state ever is or ever was. And so it's this like ultimate paradox dichotomy that is really hard to pull apart. And obviously no one should come down too hard on one side or the other. Just like anything else in life, it's nuance and there's a ton of gray area. But the way that we handle foreign affairs needs to fucking change. And like, I'm done with the excuses that I just brought up. We're like, oh, we're like in second grade vis-a-vis foreign affairs in general. Like, we're over with that. There's this great writer guy at Columbia, Wertheim. His last name is Wertheim, and he wrote sort of this autopsy of the forever wars. So the last 20 years since 9/11, the United States, or at least our leaders, have seen our military as a hammer and seen every problem as like a nail that needs to be slammed. And we've seen with our lack of success in Iraq, Afghanistan, don't forget about Libya, Yemen, and Syria, that this is not working. And that we are entering and should be entering a brand new era of foreign affairs, which I'm very excited about. But this is going to hinge on the Biden administration and on whoever comes after him to really right this ship. And so that's where I think we are right now.
Yeah, dude. And so much of Trump's criticisms came domestically, but his complete lack of education, as far as not coming up through the institutions, I think that's the big risk of having a leader who was never previously in public service or in the international affairs realm. Because I mean, sure, I'm sure extremely well traveled and has done business all over the world, but that's very different. So not that necessarily that disqualifies someone who hasn't been in the institution from doing a good job, but I think that's an important thing to consider when like we're all screaming about him being an idiot domestically. What's he doing overseas?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And a lot of people that I know, and I'm sure you know people like this too, that they think Trump is really good in foreign affairs. And they think that because he was hard on China, which personally I agree with. I think that's the right policy toward China, considering everything they're doing. And that he didn't start a new war anywhere, which is true. However, he did not end any wars like he said he would. He didn't pull out of Afghanistan like Biden did, because I think Trump has like a better kind of like feral sense of these things than Biden does,
He has a finger on the
unfortunately.
pulse for sure.
Yeah, he's got his finger
Yeah.
on some pulse, and he's
Yeah.
like, no, not going to pull out of Afghanistan. That's going to be a mess that I don't want on my hands, right?
Yeah.
He wants quick and dirty, in and out, and then take the media win. And that is not what military mobilization is like at all. But something it is a quick and dirty win is by executing Soleimani, the Iranian general, the number 3 in the entire country. And so in a split second, that guy went from being alive to dead. And when he was alive, he led like reams of covert operations all over Yemen and Lebanon, where Iran has these like proxy organizations, and he is responsible for the death and torture and oppression of like literally millions of people. And so he was a bad dude, and the world is better for him not being here. But just because Trump did a couple quick and dirty things that looked really good in the media and didn't start a new war and play the madman theory against Xi Jinping in China, doesn't mean he's a sophisticated international actor like we really, really need. I mean, this shit is so complicated. And a testament to that is how badly we've bungled it. I mean, in the United States, we have the best secondary education on planet Earth, bar none, and yet we still can't elect and appoint smart enough people to like do this right. And so Trump did a lot of really bad, irresponsible things internationally as well. I mean, he got us closer to nuclear exchange with North Korea than any other president has. And there was a moment in there when we all thought we might strike Iran and that we might strike Venezuela. Those would be really, really bad things to do, like categorically. And so he was no genius. He was just himself. And he got a couple wins in there. But through 4 years, you should be able to get a couple wins, given the just awesome power of the presidency vis-a-vis, foreign affairs. So yeah, it's a big dichotomy. And a lot of people think he was really good. But man, it was a scary world. It was really touch and go for that entire time. So personally, I wasn't a fan. Biden, I don't believe, is a man of like real vision beyond his own personal experiences, which are very valuable. I mean, he knows personal loss and personal empathy, I think, better than most presidents we've had in the last few decades. But unfortunately, I don't see him having the kind of vision, fortitude that our country probably needs, rather our world probably needs, for the U.S. to be the ultimately responsible actor to not only guarantee but like improve human liberties and material outcomes for billions of our fellow humans that are living in either like authoritarian or like quasi-authoritarian countries that just like can't get a break. I mean, they need our help. They haven't gotten it. And this circles right back to our problem in Syria. I mean, with Syria, we just bombed in one day in 2011 and said, all right, we're here. Now what do we have to do? We weren't there before. We weren't helping. We weren't doing much to try to make that place not as bad as it ended up becoming. And we need to divert tons and tons of military dollars to places like USAID, to places like Voice of America, the stuff that really moves the needle on the democratic balance that you brought up. I mean, in 120 countries around the world, out of the 200, elites just run roughshod over the non-elites. So you got like the 4% who are taking all the spots in the good schools. They're taking all the spots in the good sports teams. I mean, there's not good professional soccer clubs from the continent of Africa because their best teams are only populated by the sons of elite families. They're not taking from the millions and millions and millions of people that can't get a break and are not allowed. They're not allowed to go to good schools to get good training. They're not allowed to take out bank loans to build a small business, to kind of like pull themselves up. It's not allowed to happen because the elites are so scared of sharing with everybody else. They think they're going to be run over and probably dragged out of their palaces and beaten to death, which, like, yeah, they probably are, but they deserve to be because of what they've done to their countrymen. That's the kind of world we're living in. The United States as a government either doesn't know that or doesn't care or doesn't think that they have what it takes to really improve material outcomes around the world. And I fundamentally disagree with that. Like, we're better than this as a country and as people. We're better than this. We need to start caring about the situations that just normal global citizens find themselves in before there's a crisis in their country. And yeah, that's what I'm like blaring from the mountaintops. I'm open to being convinced of being wrong about this, but that's where I am right now.
Nice, man. I mean, I like the vision. I think there's all kinds of constraints and realistic things to think about. And I think the biggest one limiting us is just the culture wars domestically and how limiting it is. It's really hamstringing us internally because also another thing that kind of struck me was that the things you described, like the elites populating the best schools and wealth concentration, that's the same thing here.
Mhm.
You know, it's not, there is a much bigger middle class, obviously, and there are pathways to success here, but
Mhm.
the way that like there are those differences, there is the extreme wealth concentration, and there are areas that have just been generationally devout or devoid of resources for opportunity, and it's
Mhm.
like basic shit we can't fix, like decoupling schools funding from income tax or property tax.
Yep.
Why hasn't that been decoupled? Like,
Yep.
everyone agrees the data shows education is a huge way to facilitate upward mobility,
Mhm.
but we can't, in like Connecticut, for example, like richest state in the country, there are areas that are, in every state, there's an example. So,
Mhm.
and I think that they kind of like preying on people's insecurities and fears, whether like there's theories that it's like Trump's rise was indicative of the white majority's fear of being replaced, whether that be economically in a job or in the social majorities, as when it comes to like the norms of the in the culture, ethnic identity of the country, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And what happens is that people, it's so easy for us, especially with kind of fractured and divided attention spans, is that no one sits down and reads essays. It's all 5 to 7 second clips on the apps and TikTok and shit. So I don't know.
Mhm.
I think the thing is that I think history shows that when the people do rise up and kind of come together with unanimous voice, things can change, whether it be domestically or overseas.
Mhm.
But if everyone's distracted, addicted to their phones, and just being polarized, then we're not going to see those changes. So it's, yeah, man. I think that's the biggest limitation that I can see. But
Mhm.
yeah, to shift it back to domestic politics, this these incidences of extreme violence. So like the mass shootings and the individual in Buffalo who was radicalized by white supremacist theory and um, went out to murder a bunch of black people in a
Mhm.
racist attack. So what are the parallels that you see between this kind of profile and the other extremists and extremist ideology that you studied and kind of worked around?
Yeah, great question. So, what you need for a mass shooter or what you need for someone to join a terrorist group, well, first you need a psychological vulnerability, and that comes in the form of childhood trauma. It comes in the form of, something that happens to your brain that shuts down a small part of it, where your brain shuts down a part of itself for self-preservation, for protection. So something traumatic happens, and again, this is like the back of your brain, like one of the more ancient parts of your brain is like kicking into gear, and it's saying, okay, this compartment of the brain is not as important as the brain's ability to get the amygdala, which is like the alarm system of the brain, to alert the prefrontal cortex that something is bad or something is an emergency, right? So when that thing is turned down, you lose empathy, you lose patience, you lose focus. Your brain is chaotic. Your feeling of like identity is sort of like thrown off and off kilter. Your ability to connect with people is degraded. And so this is the root of like pretty much all human suffering, is a part of the brain being turned off that inhibits our ability to connect with each other. I mean, when we talk about love, oneness, that's through connection. We only feel that through connecting with each other. And so the psychological vulnerability I'm talking about takes many forms as far as like the exogenous forces that cause it, but the internal stuff is very similar. All right, so now you've got this vulnerability where a young person whose identity is still developing, like again, trying to figure out what the hell the rest of their life is going to look like. You pop out of high school or college or whatever it is, and suddenly it's all on you. Like you're not going from seventh grade to eighth grade. It's not that simple. Just like the world just opens up. You're like, well, shit. And so now you couple that with digital media, and like kids are famously more addicted and, for better or worse, more plugged into digital media than people of older generations. And this is good and bad. It's good that like we try to democratize speech, and we've got all these different other opinions, and we've got people of color and other underrepresented groups being able to have their voices heard. I mean, this is fantastic. And many more like media outlets like trying their style of news and opinion. A lot of that stuff is really good, but there's a lot of bad stuff too. There's the addictive qualities, obviously, and then there's that media companies are like any other companies. They want to, increase margins for their shareholders, and when that means choosing between funding like a long form, expository or investigatory piece,
Right.
or like getting everybody pissed off the last thing that Ted Cruz said. I mean, the 9 out of 10 you're going to go with Ted, because it gets that sort of
Yeah.
reaction. It gets the clicks and it gets the comments and it gets the shares, and that shit is dollar bill. That's like take that to the bank, right? Obviously this model is like horrifically flawed for a citizenship, democracy, mental health kind of standpoint. Okay, so now you got this young guy who's got this psychological vulnerability, trying to figure out himself, figure out the world around him and his position in that world. And he's trying to figure out like what is everybody else up to? Like what is their deal? And he is supremely vulnerable to what he hears, but not just everything he hears. He's most vulnerable to the stuff with which he can write a very concise, clear narrative. So like we always say this throwaway line, like, oh, we think in stories, which like, yeah, we say that as like a throwaway, but it's like fully true. I mean, this is
It's
baked
a
in.
heuristic.
It's a heuristic. It's baked into the cake of like how our brains function, right? So maybe you or me, like, I mean, we're talking about narratives that like the United States is not all bad, but it's also not all good. And we've got these like benevolent values, but we like imperfectly like distribute them to citizens here and then people abroad. But generally, on the whole, all things being equal at a risk adjusted basis, the United States is like is a good for humanity. I would agree with that. I think you would, and most of your listeners probably would too. Um, but someone with that kind of psychological vulnerability is going to be very vulnerable to other stories and narratives that can help redefine their position in the world as something way better than how they're feeling right now. So this 18-year-old guy who went into the Buffalo supermarket and shot those poor people, okay, um, he probably very likely felt down and out, very down on himself. If he had friends, they weren't good friends. At least he didn't feel like they were. If he had family members, he didn't feel very supported or connected to them. I'm guessing those things because this is 99.9% of these people. I mean, it sounds very crude to lump people into such a category so dismissively, but I mean, the data is there. And so when you plug into the internet and just start just vacuuming up all the garbage it has, I mean, YouTube famously, like you'll watch a totally benign, video about politics, and then an hour later you're in white supremacy land. You know what I mean? You're like getting pushed closer and closer to the dark web, where the most repugnant ideals are being, celebrated here and there. So
Yeah.
again, the algorithms in digital media, in these platforms, are tweaked and calibrated to a place to take us to obviously where it's going to ping on our vulnerabilities the hardest, but also there's an algorithm in our brains that is reaching for these things. It's a match made in hell. That's exactly what happened to this guy. So he found a narrative that made himself the protagonist of his own Manichaean good versus evil type of battle, like existential battle, this cosmic war, and he wants to be the guy or one of the guys. And so this is the narrative that like black people, people from Latin America, poor people, liberals, they're all just like ruining our society to an extent we've never seen before. And only the real patriots and the real people that not only understand this but have the balls to like take up arms against it are people like me, who are going to actually like get a gun, get in their car for a few hours and actually murder people. And he said he loved, he Facebook lived his attack like the guy in Christchurch, New Zealand did. Okay, man, that was years ago. So the other part of this is zeitgeist. And I don't know the dictionary definition of zeitgeist. Is a word that we pulled from, that we stole from German. I mean, you probably know this better than I do.
Spirit of the time, literally.
Yeah, spirit of the time.
Yeah.
So it's not, so when we call these people in my old industry, we call them lone wolves, where they're like, they don't seem to be the part of like a Hezbollah or an Al Qaeda or an ISIS, where they like are in a training camp and on the monkey bars and like ninja crawling under those ropes with their AK-47. Like that is not what this guy did. He didn't like fly to Afghanistan to go train with anybody. He was on his laptop, and
Spiraling.
he's spiraling because he saw the Christchurch attack, and he's on what, Gab or 8chan or whatever it is, talking to all these people who are all trying to one up each other as far as explaining how bad the poor immigrant liberals are and what they're willing to do to sort of be that guy. But Buffalo guy is seeing like no one's really answering the call. And so I can make myself stand out to this milieu and be like a hero in this zeitgeist that has totally captured me, to convince me that like this is something not only moral but like cosmically justified, and that I'm going to be this warrior hero if I do, even if I die, and they will sing my praises for 1,000 years and I'll be dead. But being a dead hero to this guy is better than being a loser being alive. And so that's my assessment, my psychological, unprofessional assessment of this guy in Buffalo, which is the same as Christchurch, which is the same as San Bernardino, which is the same as the Orlando like club attack, and is the same for the recruits who were in their teens and 20s, who lived in Paris, who lived in London, who lived in Wales and Ireland, who left like pretty nice places to go live, fight, and die in a dusty, impoverished war zone in northern Syria. I mean, to make that kind of decision, it just like it blows most people living in this country away. Like, why would you do that, given all the opportunities and like the splendor and just like the raw human beauty that exists in a place like Paris? Well, none of that shit matters, because their chaos, like their emergency, is the fact that they don't respect themselves. So they don't have anything to hang their hat on, like what they've accomplished or what they stand for. And when you're in the pit, when you're in the tank, when you're hitting rock bottom, like truth and logic and A plus B equals C, that shit does not matter. It just doesn't. It gets completely superseded by, you can become this like avatar warrior, and you can go to this new place and be heralded by people who don't know you yet. And you will take yourself from the fringes of society to the center of world events, which is exactly what these ISIS recruits did. I mean, they left London and Paris for a war zone, like a desert, where they were living in a shack. But suddenly their group is on the front page of every newspaper every day for 3 years. And so that's a trade-off these guys are willing to make. I would never make that. I don't think you would. You don't want a bullet to the head. You don't want to die in a pool of blood by the side of a Syrian road. I don't. Most people I know don't want to do that either. That's why you need an intense psychological vulnerability to be in that space. And honestly, the most tragic part of all this is that way too many people in our country, in our society, are almost there, because childhood trauma is not something that is exclusive to people of the Muslim faith or of the Arab ethnicity
Mm.
or of, developing countries where it's like 2% of the elite like run the entire place. Like, trauma happens here every single day and twice on Tuesdays, and we don't talk about it the right way. I mean, your whole podcast is about how do we as men like open up and start talking with like a different language and like dig deeper into ourselves and pull out like the less attractive parts of ourselves to become like better people, not just better men, but like better humans, better fathers, better boyfriends, better husbands, and just better citizens. Like, how do we treating people that you love and respect and who like you and think you're kind of cool, that's easy. Like, that is not what this is about. It's about treating the people who you previously thought were uncouth, a strain on society, and that you thought it best to like distance yourself and your loved ones from. Like, the real test is, how do you treat them? How do you think of them? And once you encounter them in the supermarket or in the comment section on Twitter, like, how much grace are you going to have? And if your instinct is to troll them and win some very frivolous, instantaneous battle against them, that means you've got work to do. You've got work to do to become a better person and to like really like dig deeper within yourself to like figure out what's important. And I'm so glad that you and a few others are trying to really do this, because, man, as developed as we think our American society is, we are nowhere where we need to be on this very point.
Totally, dude. Yeah, well said. Because it all does come back to that psychological vulnerability. Two things from there.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing about the force for good, that is the U.S., that's the debate. The thing that hangs me up is just the irony of these founding principles, liberty and justice for all men are created equal, and just how that was such a hollow value. It was revolutionary in the sense that, yes, like the limitations for suffrage were reduced compared to the context of the time, and the idea of unbiased judiciary and these things, but except if you were black or a woman.
Yeah.
Like, so to me,
Except
that's
that.
just where the like all of the good, I really like, I don't know. It's interesting because it's kind of one of those things where like they're different too. Like foreign affairs actions and the positives are very different than what happened domestically. But I think that's for me, like, that's why I don't ever see myself becoming overtly or loudly patriotic, really, just because when so many people are out there saying that like they don't feel safe, and not even in the like easy throwaway comment of like, oh, they're snowflakes, they can't take, not that, fuck that shit. I'm talking about people who actually feel like they do not belong here, even though they're born here. To me, that's fucked up. And to me, that is like a big hang up on like this whole, is the US a force for good or not? And then secondly, on the shooter and the communication thing, I think, because when I think about these people who get so lost, it's like, if they knew when they were kids that it's okay to be different or whatever other them is okay, and maybe there's a few more people who told them they love them, or just to know that like we're all weirdos. There are like, newsflash, there are no cool people.
Yeah.
Like everyone's
Yeah.
a freak, everyone's a fucking freak.
Everyone's
Okay,
a
like
freak. Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
and within that too is like the male culture of just one-upsmanship and putting each other down, and like, it's, I have the power if I can put someone else down, and it's just like super fucked up, it's
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, I think, and that's why like all of these things I see like as a root cause of just, if we can develop empathy and enable people to identify and communicate strong emotions, I think that's such a powerful change.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you just said. So you had 2 points there. I'll start with the first one. Let's go from macro to micro. So on our values, like our founding values being something that is ironically cast aside when convenient. If you happen to have time to read 1,000 pages on this exact topic, on like the history of the struggle between the like implementing our actual values to every single citizen and not. You should read Jill Lepore's book, These Truths. So it's a lot of history, but I mean, you get the general takeaway that, I mean, the founders, it's still like very up in the air, like how much they really believed in this for everybody. Um, and just like so tragic that they couldn't make it happen in that time. And that even after the revolutionary generation, so many trade-offs were made to the South, which, you know, continued to have slaves until the 1860s, that in order to keep the Union together, we had to sidestep the full implementation of these rights arguably until the 1960s with the civil rights in 1964 and then voting rights in 65. So, I mean, the other thing is that if you read the Declaration of Independence, those values are written in universalist language. They do not say that these rights are reserved by white males who own land. It does not say these are reserved for Christians. And they also don't say that these are reserved for US citizens. So there's an argument to be made that if we are fully implementing these values to the fullest, we need to extend this to everybody. I mean, maybe not, you know, bring in people from different countries to gain justice in our court system. Like logistically, that'd be very difficult. But the spirit of those values, it makes full sense, and it would make me feel better as an American if we started to think that way and operate that way, right? And so, what I think is,
It's an interesting argument.
yeah, and so I mean, we toss our values aside in international conflict like quicker than like anywhere, and
Yeah.
and one reason I believe that's happened is because there was one war in the last 80 years that was very justified in our participating and in our causing a lot of destruction. That was World War II. And so World War II was, I think, really unique in that it posed like a legitimate existential threat to the free world. You had the Nazi war machine, you had Imperial Japan that both decided, like, these other countries are gobbling up too much of the world in their exploration and colonialism. We need to not only get in on this, we need to like take it all. And so we had, you know, Japan from the West and Germany from the East. Like, the value there that unified everybody was that we all want to live in a free society, and we can't do that if these two militaries are on the march. And so the United States deployed its military to the Pacific theater and the European theater, and I personally had a grandfather in both, and I know I'm not the only one. And we, you know, like, that conflict ended and the United States emerged as a global superpower. And I think that men in the United States took that lesson to mean that as long as we use our military power, we can help further secure human liberties around the world. And that is not what happened. What secured human liberties around the world was not our victory, military victory in World War II. It's what we did to rebuild Japan, rebuild Germany, craft them into like very like hefty, economically vibrant, responsible global actors, and to establish the liberal international order around which like the United Nations revolves. So the United Nations is a place where if I'm, you know, one country and you're another country, we're about to go to blows, or I'm about to invade you or you me to like grab scarce resources. The UN is a place where we can both send ambassadors, like talk this out, so we don't resort to fisticuffs and like just one annihilating the other one. And this is this is one of the most incredible advancements of human civilization, is like taking a second to like stop and talk these things out before we resort to violence. But the US still, when our leaders get miffed, like we did before Vietnam, we did vis-a-vis, you know, 9/11 and lead up to Iraq, like 9/11 happened, that's us getting miffed. We absolutely throw our values out the window, and suddenly like human life, like the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, well, that's got to take a back seat. We have to go kill a bunch of people because what we think is politically expedient to mollifying the fears that our citizens have based on this like insane shit that just happened. Okay, so like wrap all this up in a bow, meaning that we need to do the hard non-military, non-kinetic work of outreach to the rest of the world and to push these other societies closer to viable democracies and away from semi-oppressive authoritarian political structures. And if you read my favorite political scientists, I have a bunch, but two of them are James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu. Acemoglu is at MIT and Robinson's at University of Chicago, and they team up to write all these amazing, incredible books that have a lot of data in them too. The first one is called Why Nations Fail, and the second one's called The Narrow Corridor. And it has taught us, or at least like what I gather from especially the second book, is that a vibrant, functioning democracy depends on a balance between elites and non-elites, and a government that functions so well that it can balance the two, balance the interests of the two. And here in the States, like you just said, there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of like sort of unfair meritocratic tendencies where the elites tend to stay elites, that someone who went to Harvard in the 70s can send their son to Harvard in the 2010s. Like that happens every single day and twice on Tuesdays. But our degree of that kind of corrupt elitism is of a totally different degree than it is in a place like Namibia or Cambodia, right? Like these places are, the wealth inequality is just like astronomical. So that's one good thing for us. But our values of equality and justice before the law, those inherently do not benefit elites, because elites have all the money. They've got all the access, the opportunities. They don't want to be equal. They don't want millions of riffraff to be brought up to anywhere close to their. Okay, so now there's this inherent push against liberal values by elites. Not all of them, but as a whole, they're at least incentivized to do so. It is then upon the government to boost up the non-elites and tamp down the powers of the elites. And our government is not doing that to the degree that it needs to, because its elected officials and its voters are so captured by the hostility being purported by these corporate incentivized media outlets. And there is a zeitgeist to be anti-liberal, to be non-liberal, to be fascist. That's why we're throwing the F word around so much these days. This is the equation. We now know what it takes to keep a functioning democracy functioning. And our hands are completely tied to righting our ship unless we really take it to this media model. If you pull the plug on divisive political media and you wait a few months, I think the US electorate and our society starts to look a lot differently. And I want to add one more thing. We are horrifically divided as a country. And it's like all of our guns and our hackles are out against our enemy, which is like either the liberal or the conservative on the other side of town. And that is one way to unite a people, is through a common enemy. But you can also unite a people through a common cause. And if the United States leadership were to come up with some project that we could all sort of gather around that makes us all proud to be Americans and has us see the sort of road ahead of us where we would all be getting better, liberal or conservative, that our societies would be categorically improving, I think that's the only chance we have to unite the divisions that currently mire us. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, well said. I agree. For me, it's education.
Mm-hmm.
That I guess it's not like a really sexy project to like get people fired up about. Mm-hmm. But
yeah,
I feel many of the root causes would be alleviated if we just had a better education system. And another quick, I don't know if a quick fix, but solution would be to make the profession of being an educator more prestigious. Pay good money, make it competitive. That to me is such a huge thing, and that instead of, if you know any teachers, in your life, they're probably exhausted. They're probably stressed out. They're probably feel like they are providing childcare. And to make that a more prestigious career, like I had a buddy who was down on a surf trip in Barbados, and he was out in the lineup, and then everybody came out from work because he was off, and then he hung out with them. They go to the bar, they're talking, and he's a school teacher. It was his summer vacation, and they found out that he was a teacher, and everyone's like, "Teacher, this guy's a fucking
Whoa.
teacher!" Like round of shots. You know,
Wow.
everyone was like so stoked, like thank you. You know, like you're such an important service you're providing.
Yeah.
And that kind of mentality shift about what are the real important careers in our society. You know, it's not just sure, doctors and lawyers are very important, absolutely. There's so much more though, you know,
There's
and
so much
and I
more.
feel like that gets down to also like the dignity of people and making people feel like what they do matters. And like I feel like these systems we have, these structures and the whole institutions of our democracy rely on people giving a shit, and that also comes from feeling like other people give a shit about what you do. You know, the affirmation of like, oh, my peers, my community appreciates and values and sees what I do every day. You know, and that really, I feel like that kind of lessens hostility. But yeah, dude, Brent, amazing conversation, man. We'll have to pause it, bookend it for now, but we can definitely do another one. We'll jump over to the Spark by Seek Discomfort, a little conversation game to wrap things up.
Okay.
So what is, or rather, what would you rather do? Would you rather get a question first or second?
Second.
Okay. All right. If this is a question for me. If my younger self were to see me now, what is something they wouldn't believe? That's a great question. I think that if you told myself like 8th grade, I just moved to Philadelphia, I was about to start this high school, that I was going to make a group of friends of dudes who are going to be lifelong best friends and that we're all going to be super tight 10 years later, I would be, you know, maybe I'd believe it, but I'd be thrilled. And I have that great group of friends here in Philly. So
that's
fantastic. Great guys who definitely have, they've definitely informed this whole like worldview I have too about the communication thing.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. You're the sum of the 5 people you most surround yourself with, right? All right, my turn. When was the moment you realized you are not invincible? Oh my God. That's reaching back. I definitely felt very invincible as a teen. I like succumbed to all those stereotypes. I thought I knew it all, or at least I was confident enough that I could like figure out whatever I needed to figure out. In that way, I was really lucky to have a pretty cool childhood, which had a lot more confidence than insecurity, I would say. So I did decently well in school, not straight A's, but mostly A's through grade school, junior high, high school. In college, I barely escaped with like a 3.2, which was unlike me and unlike sort of my parents and what was expected of me. But I justified it by saying that I played on my school's hockey team. I was in a fraternity. I joined a bunch of clubs and I was very active. I did a lot of traveling as an undergrad. So I'm like, okay, that wasn't a total failure. But then I got out into the working world and it was hard. Like figuring out office politics is just, it's a totally different animal than sort of like walking into a classroom, sitting down at a desk, listening to a teacher, turning to the person next to you and asking for help on the homework, and then going to a party at night and, you know, having a few beers and like just talking to people and becoming friends. Like office politics, when you're working in a company or organization, is a completely different animal. And people who should like you, they don't. And people who should not like you, for some reason, they do. And it's like very disorienting. And I took a lot of years, like a lot of years to like struggle to really figure out how to thrive in that kind of environment.
It's interesting. Yeah, I agree. I got chewed up and spit out for my first job.
Did you really?
Out of college. Oh yeah.
You're not the only one.
Oh dude, crash and burn.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Straight up fired my ass. Yeah.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
Tale told by many though. You're not alone.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome, Brent. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, man. I know you're active on Twitter, so where can anybody go get your hot takes if they want to read them?
My hot takes. My Twitter is at Brent Giannotta, which is BrentGiannotta. I'm mostly talking about Ukraine and Russia, on which I have very strong opinions about how a lot of things we're doing right, but things we can do even righter. So, Thomas, thank you so much for having me. This has been really, really awesome talking to you here.
For sure. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, dude. Thank you.
Thanks.